Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of 50 Years in the Dungeon. I'm your cartoonist pal Stan, and I'm here for another hour and a little bit of celebrating the fact that 2024 was the 50th anniversary of of not just the game Dungeons and Dragons, but the entire hobby of tabletop role playing games, and been celebrating it now for the better part of this year, getting close to having done the mission statement for this show, which is to have conversations with people who worked on the game in person, in house, the real people behind the curtain. And while I'm doing that, each time I'm doing a cartoon homage to a classic piece of D&D art, and I'm taking one from each of the 50 years that the game has been around. We're up to 2019 already, which is kind of crazy, I think. But time flies, not just in 50 years' time, in 1 year, even quicker. So, before I get even older, let's kind of go to today. My guest today was the head of D&D during, I think, probably during 2019 when the piece I'm working on, the Ghosts of Saltmarsh, is the hardcover book that I'm doing an homage to today. But he's been working in the role playing game industry about as long as I have, probably even a little bit longer. And I'm very happy to get to chat with him. I don't do it often enough. This person, of course, is Ray Winninger. And I'm going to bring him on right here. And I'm going to say, hello, Ray, and thank you very much for agreeing to
Hi,
come
everybody. Hi, Stan. Thank you.
on. How are you doing there? How's 2025 treating you so far?
2025 has been great so far. I've been working on lots of cool projects. I've got more stuff in the hopper, but I've mostly had a chance to just sort of take it easy, which is great.
That's good. It's a good start. Yeah, no, 15 days in, and nothing terrible has happened so far. I will say, knocking on glass, on cordwood. Um, yeah, you know what? I'd said that we're in about the same time, but I'm now certain that you've been actually working professionally longer than I have on tabletop games. Although I was doing art and writing at this time, I remember seeing your stuff when you were working on stuff for Mayfair when
Yeah.
I was still an interested amateur. So let's start, as I usually do, with how did hobby gaming, although that term did exist at
Yeah.
the time, how did you get into what we now call hobby gaming?
Yeah. So when I was in middle school, late grade school, middle school, fifth, sixth grade, around then, I was a chess kid, and I played a lot
Hmm.
of chess, and I played competitive chess, and I was obsessed with that for a while. And I quickly sort of learned that the other kids, the other people, adults as well, that I'd play chess with, they were way into the Avalon Hill War Games. I found the
Hmm.
Avalon Hill War Games through chess, and and I again, when I was about fifth grade, sixth grade, I started to become obsessed with those, and I played lots and lots of Avalon Hill, and the great old Avalon Hill games, Africa Corps and
Hmm.
Stalingrad and Squad Leader, which I still play quite a bit of today, and I'm involved in. And Yeah, so that brought me into hobby shops, which are and where I grew up, where you would buy those games.
Right.
The basically
Where where did you grow up?
Oh, in the Chicagoland area, south
Hmm.
side of Chicago. And they didn't really have game stores back. What we know now is like the game specialty stores. Nothing like that existed, at least nowhere near my neck of the woods. I guess you had Complete Strategist in New York, but in my neck of the woods, where you went to buy those games were the hobby shops. You'd buy model tanks and model planes and railroads, and there was the little shelf
Yeah.
with the war games over there. And so that's I'd hang out there. All those of us who played, that's where you'd find other people who'd play. And after a year or two of that, the hot game there suddenly was Dungeons and Dragons, which was this new thing. I vividly to this day, I recall almost word for word the first conversation I had with another player who was, a couple years older than me, so a high school kid, trying to explain to me what this thing was. Like what is it? It famously came in. The little original three little booklet box set was on the
Right.
shelf at the hobby shop, and
Right.
you couldn't really discern anything about the game from just looking at the packaging, but everybody was excited about this, and the hobby shop couldn't keep it in stock, and all of that stuff. And so I finally got a copy of that and just became obsessed with it very quickly, like many people who
Mm.
encountered it in those days. This was pre AD&D. I remember, so all this, I began playing in what was probably about 1977, because I remember the Monster Manual coming out shortly after I started playing. I remember standing in line to buy the Player's Handbook in
Wow.
1978 when that came out as a 13 or 14-year-old kid. And and one of the things that is really, I think, one of the reasons why I got obsessed with the game was, and this is super hard for today's fans to understand, but original Dungeons and Dragons was incredibly opaque. Like, you read those, it's no exaggeration to say that basically every group that got interested in Dungeons and Dragons kind of had to half design the game for themselves. Like, there's a bunch of ideas in these
Right.
books, and all of that stuff, and they were really fascinating ideas. But there was just all sorts of like just strange, like somebody played a bunch of these word games. Their concepts, and they're just like, wait, what? And I an anecdote that I often tell about that era that I find just sums it all up is in the original version of Dungeons and Dragons, those three books. You'd adventure in the dungeon, and if you get to a part in your game where you had to leave the dungeon and travel from one dungeon to another, one town to another, the rules actually said, well, you should go buy this Avalon Hill game called Outdoor Survival, and you should
Right.
just play that, and that's how you can manage it. I just found that, like, wait, what? Go buy another game? And D&D in that era was very much cobbled together out of other games. It was very famously, there was the essentially much of the framework for Dungeons and Dragons, which evolved in the Minnesota area that Dave
Right.
Arneson and his people, created. And then that was fused to a game called Chainmail, which was a miniatures, or actually even a supplement for Chainmail, which was
Right.
miniatures combat. And sort of everybody who played D&D in those early eras sort of Frankenstein together their own game out of bits and pieces of other games and things they would create, and that spirit really captivated me. I just that's what drew me to it. And in fact, I think this was when I would go on to take over Dungeons and Dragons all those years later. Sort of the cornerstone of the strategy that we built was that that's I believe strongly, and the people who are responsible for the latest version of D&D believe strongly that this notion of creating things is what really draws people to the game, and what we tried to bring more of that spirit back to it, of like
Right.
you're creating your own stuff and your own characters and your own worlds and that sort of thing. So that was how I found my way there. By about 1977, 78, I was playing D&D. um by 1979, I'd seen the first couple, or the first ones I was exposed to, adventure modules.
Mm-hmm.
The Glacial Rift of the Frost Giant Jarl G2, I think, was the first one I saw. And so I spent a summer there, at an old electric typewriter, typing up my own dungeon module, trying to imitate that. Wrote this big manuscript, finished that about halfway through the summer. This would be about 79. Decided it was garbage, so started again on a second one. And so the point is that within a couple years of encountering the game, I was already sort of writing and trying to create my own stuff to distribute more broadly than just the gamers I was playing with. And my first sale, my first professional RPG product, the first thing I wrote, would have been in early 1984. I was a senior in high school when I was working with the new company FASA. Having grown up in
Hmm.
Chicago, FASA was in my backyard.
Yeah.
I met them at conventions and that sort of thing, and so I wrote an adventure for their Doctor Who RPG, which they had just gotten the license to, and that was the first thing that I had
Wow.
published. Uh, then went off to college, and all my college years, I basically I went to Northwestern University in the Chicagoland area. I put myself through college designing RPGs. I would study during the day and do all that stuff, and or the early part of the evening, I should say, and then late in the evening, I would sit down and I'd work on the latest thing I was doing for FASA or Mayfair by then, or TSR. I was
So
soon
the
managing.
interesting thing, I think that people, you say that, and my thought is that some people are going to think, "Wow, you got paid a lot more," and but really, college was a lot cheaper.
It
But
was.
but
It was.
but
Although it was interesting that back in those days anyway, the way things worked was particularly the University Northwestern where I went. It was very much what you paid was very much a function of how much you could afford to pay.
well,
I, I
that's
I've heard that it's not nearly that rosy anymore. But when I started, it was very I didn't have to pay much to go to
mm,
Northwestern. But in truth, over those few years there, I started making a reasonable amount of money writing all this
right,
RPG
right.
stuff. And so all that meant was, I was just paying more and more to go to college. I was, by the time I graduated, I was just basically paying full tuition writing RPG stuff.
um, so were you working for any other companies at the time, or was all the stuff with Fossa?
So it started with FASA.
And they
Uh,
had so a lot of the new younger folk watching this will not know Fossa directly. What besides Doctor Who, what else did Fossa do?
So FASA started. FASA was founded by a couple of guys. A guy by the name of Jordan Wiseman, who goes on to become a legend in gaming,
Yes, it was founded a lot of things.
and yeah, and I Jordan and I worked together on a project just 6 or 7 years ago. We still chat, and Ross Babcock was his partner, and they originally started FASA to produce sort of third party material for Traveler, the science fiction RPG
Right.
from Game Designers Workshop (GEW). And they started. I think their first products they were really great at drawing like ship blueprints, and I think they started doing that. But not too long after founding FASA, they got the rights to Star Trek, and they did the
Hmm.
first. Well, actually, technically, wasn't the first Star Trek RPG. There was a weird little thing prior to that, but the first, real sort of slick and polished Star Trek RPG. And that Star Trek RPG was basically maybe the first slick and polished licensed RPG. Period.
Among them, yeah, certainly.
And that did really well for them and really put them on the map. And so from there, they got some other licenses, Doctor Who and that sort of thing. But really, FASA came into its own when they created Shadowrun and BattleTech. Those are the big franchises that were created by FASA, owned by FASA, and still exist today in various permutations. So from FASA, Mayfair Games, which was also in the Chicagoland area, I got to know them. They were doing a licensed game based on DC Comics, and so I was looking to do more and more sort of RPG work. It's funny, I had no idea. I didn't know anything about comics at the time, but I saw this early RPG that they had, and I thought it was just terrific. I thought the design was very clever and very interesting, and so I started talking to Mayfair. I went down to the local comic shop and said, "Hey, pick out a handful of DC comics for me. I want to read these and kind of get a sense of this because I'm going to be working on this stuff." And then just had a great experience with that and worked on that DC game for 8 or 9 years, all told, in different ways. Uh, just had some surreal things happen
Right.
on that. And then of course TSR as well. When I started professionally selling RPG stuff, of course I was trying to get into D&D. Was a huge game for me, still my favorite game, the game I played the most, like almost everybody else in those days. And and I started working for TSR as well when I was in college.
All right,
Um,
hold on a sec. We got a couple of comments, and then I'm also going to switch over and start my drawing. So we got
okay.
Michael Pastor, who has been here. Says he says congratulations on the DC Heroes release, and
Oh,
says that the
thank you.
source books are some of his favorite books, and he's particularly a huge Legion and DC fan. So
Ah, great, great.
um,
And Michael there, by the way, is referring to, so having just brought up DC, just recently here, just within the last month, I worked with DC Comics and Cryptozoic to reprint all those old DC Heroes books from all the way back that I'm talking about, the ones I was writing in the mid 1980s. Those are all coming back into print, which is very exciting.
so if people want to find out about that, is should they go to Cryptozoic now? Now that
Yeah,
Kickstarter
go to Cryptozoic and
yeah.
you'll see it there. Yeah.
And Ed Stark says hi, Ray.
Hey Ed.
And Alfred Stream has just shown up. Alpha Stream, by the way, is the guy I was telling you about beforehand who sent some questions in ahead of time. If you are a
Yeah,
subscriber to our free newsletter, I'm going to pull it up early this time. We have a free newsletter at 50yearsinthedungeon.substack.com. Every week, I make an announcement about who our guest this week is going to be with an invitation. Submit questions, and I'll pull them aside and ask them. I've been going for 50 weeks. This is the 50th episode. This is the first time anyone has responded to one of those with questions. So I want to make sure that I get Alpha Stream's questions on the air. I will so just so you know, I will be fiddling with them and making them more conversational. But I've got them written down here, so we'll be getting
excellent,
into those.
excellent.
Which says my volume is lower. Yeah, my mic is not the best mic, but it'll do. Hopefully, I mean, if you can't understand me, let me know. If I'm so low that I'm not legible, but if you watch any of the old episodes, this is kind of what it is. All right, so I'm going to take that off the screen, and I'm going to switch over here. And as I say, the Ghosts of Saltmarsh hardback is what I'm doing the homage based on. This came out during this is 2019. Were you there when it
I was
printed?
at Wizard, but I took over the D&D team toward the tail end of 2019. So this book was published not long before I took over the team.
Because I was there when it was being written. I was there as a contractor in 2018
Got it.
when it
Got
was
it.
out with the freelancers and coming in and going through editing.
Yeah.
So
Got it.
this may be the only book that both I and my guest had some involvement in, and both of us are tangential. But all right. So you were talking about the freelancing you were doing. Some for so were you doing stuff for TSR, for the game, for the main game, or for RPGA? I know Mike Selinker. Sorry
Yeah.
to take the mic for a minute, but Mike Selinker was on a couple of weeks ago and talked. He also was in the Chicagoland area. I think
Hmm.
did he go to Northwestern? I mean, he might have. He went to. Uh, I think he did. But he did a lot of writing, and he wound up working in Chicago area. A lot of work for RPGA in that era. Um, How about you? Were you doing products for the main lines, or
Yeah. So I was working on my first stuff for TSR was for AD&D first edition. Module I-13 was the first thing I think they published that I wrote.
what was I-13? What was the
Um, Adventure Pack 1. It was basically an anthology of short adventures.
okay? Um, what? So you say you were doing more than that? What
Yeah.
get
So
associated
that
with
was
any
the
of the
first thing.
worlds at the time? Or?
Back in those days, this was pre second edition. So, they didn't really have the plethora of settings and whatnot yet. That would come later as I was working with them. I did, however, work on the last of the first round of Dragonlance Adventure DL
Mm-hmm.
15. Worked on that. I worked on a couple of products for the D&D line. So this again is super confusing to modern fans, but back in those days, D&D was actually two games. There was Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and they
Right.
had a lot of similarities, but they weren't exactly the same. Um, and in fact, I was about to say that D&D was really designed for, or was really catering toward sort of less experienced players, but that's not 100% true. It was always a little bit confusing how those two lines related to each other. But I did some stuff with
Yeah.
the D&D line.
No less so to the people in house.
Yes. And because I was doing a lot of stuff for Mayfair, I worked on some high profile uh, things for Mayfair at the time. I had this surreal experience that I've written about a few years ago, where when I was in college, I just started college and I was working on the Mayfair RPG. And Mayfair, I had really liked what I was doing, and there was this exciting new thing that they wanted to do that DC was really excited about, but was a brand new thing that brand new to DC. Mayfair asked me to work on it, and that was the Watchmen. That was the now the seminal sort of graphic novel that we all know. When I was a sophomore in college, I found myself collaborating with Alan Moore on Watchmen material. And of course, while we were working on that, Watchmen was starting to be published, and it became a big thing, and therefore it was a pretty high profile RPG product at the time. And because of that, in part, I think at TSR, they started to push me more toward like their non D&D stuff, like Marvel
Right.
superheroes. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff for that. They thought, well, this is a superhero guy. Put him on Marvel superheroes. I did work on the Top Secret revival, Top Secret SI. Still kept doing D&D, but found myself doing a lot of that stuff as well. Around that same time, I also worked I was doing some work for West End. I worked on their Star Wars game in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent 6 months one year just out of college on site at West End. That's where I met Ed Stark. So, hey, Ed. Working on Torg, the West End RPG Torg. I was one of
Right.
the designers on that who created that for West End.
You were basically had your hands in all of the mid-level companies of the mid '80s.
Oh yeah, yeah, and that wasn't that uncommon certainly back then. I mean, you could, you know, in those days, like of course the business of RPGs is a sort of complicated topic, and the boom and bust eras that they've gone through and so forth. But surprisingly, like while I was in college, and then I continued to, as a full time RPG freelancer for a couple of years out of college, you could make reasonable money. Like I was, I coming out of Northwestern, like I was making more money than most of my friends who had gone to Northwestern, which was a pretty decent school, and they were going on sort of regular 9 to 5 jobs. you could make decent money if you basically you followed guidelines and hit your deadlines.
Yeah.
You did that, you were okay, and that was the way you did it. You cultivated relationships with everybody, and you worked with, that was part of what made that era friendlier for freelancers. That there were a lot of potential companies that you could freelance for. The industry was a little bit more diversified in terms of, the publishers in the industry. There were more publishers
It,
at a higher profile back then.
it's a weird benefit of that self publishing is given uh, to the industry, to the games industry, in that the bar for getting stuff out there is much lower, right?
Yeah,
It's now so much easier to be a one man garage band, or just you and your friends putting stuff out. But because
yeah,
of that, I think that's one of the main reasons, again, in my opinion, that we see a much smaller selection of mid-sized professional companies that can pay you. That it's
yeah,
harder to earn a living from other people doing game work, game than it was in the 80s and the 90s. But
yeah.
it's easier to get from 0 to 10 than it is to get from 10 to making a minor living.
That's exactly right. One of the things that, sort of the oddities of RPGs as a business was, the numbers in those days in the 80s. The average sales. What a mid, like not even top, not TSR, but a company like FASA or Mayfair.
Mm,
The average sales on the books that they would produce were pretty high compared to, basically up until very recently with the 5e boom and what you saw. You'd a mid-tier sort of, FASA book could easily sell 25 or 30,000 units, which is a, sort
right,
of, compared to, much of the 90s I'm sorry, the early 2000s was a big number. But the flip side of that was the expenses were dramatically higher.
right,
So a mid-tier operation like a FASA or a Mayfair back in those days, was 25 or 30 people, because you needed a bunch of specialists. This is, when I started freelancing, this was before things like desktop publishing and the digital revolution. My first batch of products, the way they were produced is, after you literally print out a manuscript on paper, and an editor would edit it largely on paper, and then, they would hire a typist to type this thing into a typesetting machine, where then another specialist who understood typography would work on it. That would connect to, this gigantic machine called an image setter, which is really just a big fancy printer, and they would print out the typeset text in these long, long columns. And then by hand, you'd cut those columns,
yep,
you'd cut those strips into columns, and you'd paste up pages. And so all these people were specialists that you had to have on staff. And you also had, even companies like FASA and Mayfair had big warehouses of their own that they maintained, and warehousing staff and all of that stuff. So, we were reaching more people, but the expenses were a lot higher. And, when it came to paying freelancers, for instance, it was, well, there were so many other expenses that it was
yeah.
just part and parcel of that.
Yeah. I mean, you certainly it was professional publishing. You needed the same the same staff that
Absolutely.
anyone that was from a newspaper to a magazine to a small independent book publishers. You needed these, as you were saying, these skilled people, these tradesmen. So
Exactly. The
um,
art would come in on paper, and you would put the art on a stat camera, this huge machine. Another thing, another group of specialists knew how to, sort of photograph that art and get that they used to call the art they used to call it camera ready. Can you deliver camera ready art, which
Yeah.
meant it's ready to just be photographed to be put inside the books. And that remained true in the RPG industry until until about 93 to 95. That's when that really started to change. But my
But
first,
it only started to change then. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
because again, because I came out of the mixed discipline of writing and art, right?
yeah,
I wanted to come in as a designer, and just because of it was harder for them to find people with the art skills, so they offered. I wound up going to West End as a graphic artist,
oh,
um,
great.
and trying to get out of that as quickly as possible. Uh, but yeah, you had to know the stat cameras. It was all physical paste up. We still had waxers. We didn't use them as
Yeah,
often as they had, but that's going into the mid '90s. And if you wanted to do desktop publishing, was still you needed PageMaker, and you had to have that wasn't something everyone just had,
right.
and you needed professional training to learn how to use it.
And a computer that was
Yeah,
powerful enough to run it, which was not every computer in those days. That was a fairly high end
right.
computer even. Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah,
you
it's.
know,
I think it's right around the millennium when there was enough desktop publishing had gotten to the point where it really was anyone's desktop, and you could start to do it.
yeah,
And it was also when sending out digital products began to be even a glimmer of a real possibility.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
no, sorry. Now I've taken it away from the conversation of you to me, and I'm here every week. So let's.
Well, to pick up my narrative, I mean, so I freelanced for a couple of years out of college, and then I found myself on staff at Mayfair Games. I took over the R&D department at Mayfair. So the game designers and the editors and the art professionals. Just about that time that we're starting to transition into digital publishing. All of that. And that was a really, I was really fortunate experience because basically I was young, I was still a kid. I was what I would have been like 20, 22, 23 years old, something like that. And I found myself managing this team of, probably 18 people or so.
Mm,
And so like anywhere else, somebody my age wasn't going to get that opportunity. uh, and so I basically had this crash course in like, oh, you gotta like learn how to, I mean, managing the team, and also like you gotta like come up with a strategy, and you gotta
right.
learn how to communicate that. You gotta learn how to deal with the people and get them on board and all of that stuff. So essentially it fast forwarded my career a little bit. It allowed me to skip a few rungs, and which was great, because then the next big milestone is the RPG industry goes into a big slump right about the time that Magic the Gathering comes out.
Okay.
The history of hobby gaming until relatively recently, and we'll see, maybe over the long term this trend will hold, but hobby gaming was a series of like big trends that would knock off the old trend. So I mentioned earlier that when I started, I was way into the Avalon Hill war games, and those were, that was a big era. The Avalon Hill was a big company that sort of dominated, or relatively big, but dominated the hobby gaming sort of space. And then along comes Dungeons and Dragons, which sort of sweeps that away, and the war games and the Avalon Hill and its competitors sort of get pushed into the corner as a niche. And it reigns supreme for a while. But then here comes Magic the Gathering, and Magic the Gathering sort of does the same thing in a way to role playing games. That the audience was so excited by the CCGs and was putting so much of their sort of mind share toward them. which was obviously great for Wizards of the Coast and that sort of thing. But also the retailers, this is another thing that made that era very different. There was no Amazon or anything like that. Mail order was a tiny, tiny, tiny slice of anybody's business. All your games were basically sold through these hobby shops, or now you're starting to get a few game stores and that sort of thing. And so, retailers and distributors could make or break whole games and whole categories with what they decided to carry. And, when Magic was really hot and the retail stores were putting all their capital toward carrying more Magic and whatnot, that sort of further sort of pushed RPGs to the side. So, so when that happens, and Mayfair basically wound down, and in that incarnation of Mayfair anyway, it would go on for reinvent itself for a few years in another as board game publisher primarily. But that was happening to so many of those mid-tier RPG companies we were talking about. I go from there to I make the trek, which so many of us did, to video games, and I went into video games. And again, because by that point I had, I was a general manager, and I managed this team, and I had this leadership position. I sort of, again, kind of got jumped up and was able to come into the video game industry with quite a bit of responsibility. So I worked on the Sony PlayStation. That was my first big thing. We were launching the Sony PlayStation. I worked with Sony, and we were, I was part of my what I ended up doing was sort of helping figure out what titles PlayStation needed to launch with, and working on some of those titles. And so from there, I made the transition into, now I'm in technology and making video games and that sort of thing. Did that for several years. I went from Sony to, I worked at Viacom, which was Viacom, Paramount Pictures, and MTV. This was in the first wave in which all the entertainment companies saw gold in the video game hills, and all were trying to create video game units. And so, and again, I came in as an executive producer there. And, again, because I was fortunate enough to have that experience at Mayfair, I was very young to be an executive producer in video games, and still kind of, frankly, figuring out what I was doing. But I had this great opportunity and worked on a bunch of interesting stuff there. Ultimately, where that goes is I end up then sort of transitioning over the years from video games into just general technology. I ultimately, it's funny, I spent about 10 years in tech, not working on games at all, just working on technology. I found myself at Microsoft, and I was what we called a platform strategist then. And so, my job was basically to work with the senior execs at Microsoft and think about big problems like, geez, what's the future Windows, and where should Windows go, and all of that stuff, and ended up leading a quite large team there. And that
you're quite the man.
that was very lucrative, and essentially that pushed me to a whole other, I opened up a whole series of doors for me. And ultimately, I'm going to skip a few steps in the interest of brevity, but ultimately put me in a place where, by the 2010s and that sort of thing, I was in a place where I got to do, I didn't really have to do anything I didn't want to do. I could do exactly what I wanted to do. And that's when I wanted to go back to Dungeons and Dragons. That game, I never stopped playing it. I actually never stopped designing for Dungeons and Dragons. While I was at Microsoft and doing all that tech stuff, I was writing a column for Dragon Magazine about how to be a dungeon master, and that sort of thing. I early in the 5e era, I worked on one of the first 5e campaigns with my friends at Green Ronin, Out of the Abyss, which is one of the first published 5e campaigns. And
of the Green Ronin folk, Nicole Lindros is in the chat now.
Oh, hey Nick, hey. Nicole's a dear friend. And so and how I went back to Dungeons and Dragons, particularly, or how I made the decision I wanted to go back to Dungeons and Dragons was one day I was reading an article here. By now, of course, I'm in the Seattle area of Microsoft,
Mm,
and the Seattle School for Girls here in the area. I was reading this article about how they had this incredible Dungeons and Dragons club that the girls at this sort of middle school had put together. And they had this impressive, like, they had a clubhouse and it was all decked out in D&D, regalia and all of that. And I was specifically reading an article about how a couple of employees from Wizards of the Coast, a couple of people from the D&D team, Jeremy Crawford and Kate Welsh,
mm,
how they were visiting the school and teaching these just talking to these girls about the experience of making D&D and what made D&D great and everything. And I was so inspired by that article. I particularly, I'm somebody who, the experience I had with D&D, D&D to me is more than just a game, more than just something we do for fun. I mean, I think D&D is something that changes people's lives, and I've seen that repeatedly.
yep.
I've already sort of given you a hint at how things I learned writing D&D, designing D&D allowed me to build this super successful career and whatnot. So many of us have met our best friends and our spouses and whatnot playing D&D.
Right.
Uh, and and particularly seeing this article, what excited me was how it was becoming clear to me that, wow, D&D is reaching this bigger and more diverse audience than it ever has before. Not only that article, but I'd seen my friends' young daughters grow up loving D&D, including Nicole's daughter Kate,
Mm-hmm.
and and I just and that just that became my mission in my head. Is I want to get this game in front of as many people as possible, and I want them to have the opportunity to have the experience with it that I had. And I was very excited that Wizards was making progress against that. That you know, back in those days when I started working on D&D, the D&D audience was a very very nerdy niche,
Right.
and I could tell it was becoming more than that. And so I worked my way into, I started at Wizards. I obviously I had friends there, but I started running a tech team at Wizards. I came over there to help them out with some technology, but my goal was really I just wanted to be involved in this, taking D&D more broad. And within a year or two of that, they decided, well, I should really be running the D&D team, and so that's what I did, and was very very honored to have that opportunity to come in and sort of chart the course of D&D for a few years, and really very successful as well. It was a great time to be working on D&D. D&D, when I started, the goal that I was given by management was to double the size of the D&D business in 5 years. Like, in 5 years, can you double? Then, and again, the game
Right.
was already upswing. I don't mean take credit for everything that was going on, because lots of great things were happening, but we doubled the size of the D&D business in just under 3 years. So it was a great time to be there, and a fantastic experience.
So I wonder if you have any thoughts as to uh, presume that you made a lot of good choices and worked with a lot of good people and did a lot of good things. Th-
No.
what what made this era different for the growth of D&D?
Yeah. So there's a few things that I think, and by the way, just to put a sense of perspective on it for folks, um, D&D now, and in the era when I was fortunate enough to come back and take over, was so much more successful than it has ever been. To sort of give you a sense of scale, we were selling back when in my time in D&D, we were selling about as many players' handbooks every year as were sold for most of the whole third edition era. And this was, 5e when I took over is already 7 years old. And so 7 years in, we're still selling, you know, uh, many, many players handbooks every year. And at that sort of rate. So the
And,
relative
and again,
size.
and for those who don't know that, for in the offices, in whether it's Wizard or TSR, the sales of core books is really the numbers that you're looking at,
Mhm.
because that is your steady across the year's products, and everything else relies on them. You can have a
Yeah,
big hit with an Eberron or a Forgotten anything, but that's going to have a those are going to be more volatile generally, and the core
yeah,
books are the measure. So
yeah.
charting up, uh, growing sales there is that's the growth you want.
Exactly, and the other releases were doing quite well too. But yes, the core books were it the story up until 5e of D&D is that each new edition would sort of debut, have a fantastic first couple of years, and then sort of gradually taper off until it would hit a point, depending on the edition, but 5 years out, 8 years out, whatever, where it's like, okay, the sales have dwindled enough that we really have to do a new edition to sort of pump up the sales again and start that machine all over again. That never happened with 5e. 5e, the core book sales just increased every year all the way up through my whole tenure there. And again, it was already 7 years old at that time, so it was reaching a much much larger audience. And this is all preamble to answer your question of, well, so what happened? Why did it suddenly get so much
I was
larger?
about to get back to that.
And I think there's a couple of things. So there were some smart decisions that were made, just during my time there, but prior to my time there as well. Really, in the 5e era, the 5e foundation, um, there were some simple things on the business level, like for instance, one of the major differences between D&D today and D&D back in my first tour of duty on D&D was that campaigns are much shorter today, and characters level much much faster than they used to. Back in the old AD&D days, you would the expectation is a DM would run a campaign basically forever. Everybody would run their campaign that would last forever, and your character, it was not uncommon, to reach seventh or eighth level. You'd have to play the game for a couple of years to level up that much generally. By the time we hit the 5e era, the average campaign lasts about 6 to 8 months, and characters go from first level to 12th or 15th or whatever level across just those 6 months. And so, what that means from a business perspective is people are going to buy more stuff because they're cycling through campaigns and books faster than they used to. So, so there's that.
So
Um,
can I jump in there with
sure.
some uh, when we when Wizards bought TSR and they brought us out, they did some market research, which is something that TSR
Yeah.
almost never did. Not in
Yeah.
the organized way that Wizards was doing it, and that was one of the things we found out. The belief that most people were running the game the way you just described wasn't true. Then it was uh, the mistaken thought that we had, because that's how we and our friends most often played, and how Gary
Sure.
and the people were. That one of the things we found out in 1997, 1998, when they did those first bits of market research, was that the average campaign was 9 to 11 months, and,
Sure.
and then they started playing a new campaign. It wasn't like um, you know that was it, but a campaign would only last that long, and so a business strategy based on servicing an ongoing, ever growing thing was
Yeah.
um,
Well,
not really
two
feasible.
things there. I mean, so first of all, that was a gradual evolution that happened between,
Right,
1978 and again, it was clearly the way things were evolving and
right.
that era you're talking about. But also, really, I should have been more clear. The product line itself was much more tailored to that old Gary way of playing until relatively late, and it really hit full fruition when you hit the 5 year, where the product line is much more. The product line started to revolve around, here's your 6 to 9 month campaign in a single book. Just go run this campaign, and we'll give you another one to run, and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
So you have that, and there were a bunch of other just smart decisions that were made. But I think the main things that really dramatically accelerated its growth weren't necessarily under the control of Wizards. And I think there were two things in particular. One, I already mentioned that the audience grew much, much more diverse. And so, back when I was, when I was freelancing for D&D in the 80s and early 90s and whatnot, no kidding, the audience was probably 90% male, 88% male, something like that. Now we fast forward to the 5 year, and during my time there, the audience actually tipped over and hit a point where it was 50-50 male to female. And so what that basically means is you just doubled the size of your audience, because you're still reaching those young, high school boys and things you're reaching, but the high school girls are now playing too. And so you have, twice as many people who are interested in this game, which is a big growth accelerator. And then really though, the thing that I put down is the number one, sort of the number one factor is the birth of YouTube, and sort of the, not just the birth, but the ascendance of YouTube and the omnipresence of YouTube. And one of the quirky things about D&D was always that D&D, while the game itself is relatively simple in conception, it's a pretty easy game, right? Hey, you describe to me what the situation is. I tell you what I want to do. We roll a die here and there. It was always a problem that the game always had, was it was relatively unapproachable. That if you were somebody who was sort of intrigued by Dungeons and Dragons in 1991, your options were go find a group that's already playing it somewhere who will teach you how to play it, or go buy these 3 college textbooks and
Right.
and assimilate all those and
Yeah.
try to figure out what the game is from that. Now, of course, by the time of 5e, with maturity of YouTube and that sort of thing, if you're somebody who's intrigued, you're a high school kid, is like, oh, D&D, that sounds pretty interesting, you can just pull up a YouTube video and watch people play D&D and very quickly sort of understand, oh, I get it, I understand what that game is and how it works.
And
And so I think that was the biggest factor.
yeah, and even more so, and I totally agree with you. Uh, Maybe not more so. On top of that, the fact that even if you don't go actively searching for it, right? You're saying if you want to find out about D&D, you can now go find it. Well, I think that one of the biggest things we couldn't control for and couldn't invent ourselves is the popularity of people who aren't interested in D&D becoming interested in the actual play games.
Yeah.
That seeing other people play this game that you otherwise would have turned your nose up, and suddenly
Hmm.
saying, "Oh no, I want to play that,"
Yep.
and
Yep.
that
And then, of course, you also have, hand in hand at the same time, this sort of broader sort of evolution in pop culture at large, where the sort of nerd renaissance, where all the
right,
things that were nerdy and nichey back in the early 90s, or the late 80s or what have you, suddenly become very cool.
right,
So like, again, as somebody working on this stuff in the mid 80s, if I could time travel back and tell myself in 1985 that in the
yeah,
future Marvel will be the biggest entertainment juggernaut on the planet and will be making the biggest movies, and will be the most successful
yeah.
franchise on the planet.
This comic that you just read is going to be the basis of the biggest hit of the summer of 2007.
Yeah, like I just like you're kidding, right? And Dungeons and Dragons will, be making hundreds of millions of dollars a year and all of that stuff. And and it'll become such a just sort of commonplace thing in the culture that A-list celebrities are playing it and talking about it all the time wherever they go. And and again, I think that was sort of beyond Wizards' control.
Yeah,
Um, Now, but as a business, an important factor that, just setting aside why did more people suddenly glom onto it as a business and what accelerated the business numbers, a very important, interesting thing happened, which was, when 5e debuted, D&D was sort of at a low point at that, coming off the fourth edition, which, by the way, I think was a terrific game. Let me,
yeah,
I found fourth edition really interesting, but it didn't really sort of find the audience in the way it hoped to and whatnot. And so D&D was sort of at a low point. And what happened was Wizards dramatically scaled down the size of the D&D team and sort of, divested from D&D. There were actually real serious questions about, are we at Wizards about, are we still going to make this game? Like,
yeah.
is this a business we want to be in? And so a serendipitous thing that arose from that was Wizards made far fewer D&D products because the team was so small. They could only manage to, get out a couple products a year or whatnot. And what they discovered relatively quickly, 2 years into 5e, is that we're selling way more copies of these couple products than we used to of those giant,
Yeah.
those, again, at the height of my freelancing TSR, there were 60 D&D products a year, at least every year.
Oh,
And,
at least. I
and
mean, when I got to TSR, there were generally 6 to 8 and sometimes 10 products a month.
yeah, exactly. And so, one of the things that we discovered from a business perspective was, wow, all of those products basically were just the business term that the charming business term for it is cannibalization. Those products were just cannibalizing each other. When,
So
when TSR was shoving 10 products out a month or 6 products out a month.
the really
And,
interesting thing to
the
me, I'm sorry,
oh,
uh,
go ahead. Yeah.
um, the really interesting thing to me is I mean, a lot of people have talked about that. That's what happened growing when Wizards bought them in and going into the third edition. Why all of the worlds kind of got pulled back and eventually tabled for a while was that cannibalization you're talking about. But the
Mm,
thing you're talking about now also is in the fourth to fifth edition, they weren't doing they weren't doing worlds, but they were still putting out a product a month. It was a hardcover a month for a while.
yes.
And
Yes.
so it's and I don't say this to point fingers at anyone, because I was on staff for some of that anyway. But the fact that the vision of that lesson that was learned in the the business information, the data gathering of '98, was kind of lost on the team of 2010. That they created a different version of the same product problem. And what you're saying is that one of the things that fifth edition team did that was so smart was cut it back again. Cut it back so
Yeah.
everyone will buy every product.
Well, and to be honest, like in the earliest days of fifth edition, I think they would have loved to have done a product every month. They just didn't have the resources for it. And then they sort of discovered that, oh, but wow, we're actually not losing anything by just producing 3 or 4 books a year. Um, and a very interesting thing happened from a business perspective when I took over D&D. Like legacy, for the longest time, D&D was in publishing what you call a front list driven business, and what that means is
Yeah.
the latest products are almost all your sales. It's the new books you sell. And in that era when TSR was pumping out all those products, or when in third edition there was a hardcover every month or whatever, or later in that era, um, the typical life cycle of a D&D product would be 60 to 90 days. The book would come out, it'd be around in the stores for a month or two. Sales would sort of then drop off and it would more or less disappear, unless it was a very major, something like the Forgotten Realms box set that didn't happen to. But most of the releases, that's what would happen. They would basically be gone in 60 to 90 days. And, so that's front list driven business. D&D in the fifth edition era evolved into what we call a backlist driven business. And what that means is about two-thirds, between two-thirds and 70%. So right about there, 65 to 70% of D&D's sales every year were the old products. The new products were just a third of the sales. And so, one thing one easy way to illustrate this is if you look at the 5e product line, nothing's really ever gone out of print. That Out of the Abyss that I referenced, which was the second campaign I believe published for 5e, and that was published now 10 years ago. That's still in print. Wizards
Right.
still sells that, which is sort of astounding. And that transition from a front list driven business to a backlist driven business put just really brought a lot more certainty and predictability and health to the D&D business overall. It was a major development when that happened. Because there's only a handful of campaigns, or I think I wanted to take us up to 6 releases a year, although like 1 or 2 of those would be oddballs each year. But just essentially a release a quarter.
Right.
Every one of those releases is special. And
Right.
so, when a group finishes a campaign today, they look at the backlist and they're like, we've never played Curse of Strahd from 8 years ago. Let's pick that up and finally play that. Or we've never played Ghosts of Saltmarsh
Right.
here that you're drawing, or what have you. And so all that really yielded huge dividends. That's sort of the economic engine that boosted D&D into this other realm. Oh, and one more thing, actually, another very important factor is digital. So
Yeah.
digital, huge contribution to the D&D business, and particularly because those digital copies of the books that you sell through D&D Beyond, those are very high margin. Those are almost all profit. You've already built the book. You
Right.
can now just sell endless copies of it at no marginal cost. Huge. So all
Yeah.
of that added together basically turned D&D into this, just on a pure business level, as I said, like, well into the 9 figures, and we're off to the races.
Right. All right. So I'm going to stop drawing now. This is where we're at. I will finish this off screen. In my private, as I've said the last couple of shows, December I fell behind. I'm still catching up. But if you are a subscriber that I mentioned earlier, the 50 years in dungeon.substack.com, you'll be the first ones to see the finished pieces, and maybe I'll show some process in between pieces since I'm so far behind. I need to give you guys something. I need to give back to the people. But you'll be the first to see it if you're a subscriber. It's totally free. Uh, if you have a paid subscription, is an option. You get extra things like when I'm finished, there's a process video that you'll get to see. But I'm not pushing that. I'm pushing the free subscription. Almost everything goes to the free. So
Fun.
so sign up there. You can see this when it's done. I'm gonna switch that off screen so it's just you and me again for a second here. Well, not for a second. I also want to grab those questions I said I was going to ask,
Yeah,
especially
I've
at
noticed some.
the stage of your career where these are pertaining to.
I see. What did I major in college? I was an English literature major in college.
Me too.
Um,
Let's
I
see.
had I was I mentioned I when I was in college I worked with Alan and Dave on Watchmen, and like when I was a sophomore in college, and we had
Right.
all these kind of before it was even a thing. We'd been talking about it, and by the time I was a senior in literature, English literature, I was in a class on the American novel in my
Yeah.
senior year, and the professor started lecturing on Watchmen, and so it was a super super cool thing. I never pointed out to her that actually neither one of the people who created Watchmen were American, and all of that. But it was a super bizarre little English
it's
literature
it's weird.
moment.
Every once in a while, you wind up these situations where, oh, by the way, yeah, I worked on that. Yeah. I have a really good story about a friend of mine who um, who went to film school later in his after having a big good chunk of his career decided he wanted to get a degree to go with what he was doing, and had a situation like that where the professor started talking about something that he had worked on. I'll tell you know what
Yeah,
I will tell you it off
yeah.
screen, and maybe one of these days I'll just do an entire episode where I just tell my stories about him because he has lived an incredible life. Um, but yeah, no, it's weird when that happens.
Yeah, it was funny.
Uh,
Uh,
so yeah, one of the questions already answered. Alpha Stream was asking. You just finished
yeah,
talking about the process of how 5e came up and how that had been. You know, I think you and I were again tangentially in the house when that was going on, but weren't
yeah.
actually involved in it. So that's the answer to that, Alpha Stream. Um,
Yeah, I came in 5e was already, established and doing well when I came in. I mean,
yeah,
it continued to hockey stick and accelerated. I like to think it's because of some of the stuff that we did, but again, there's other. It was I don't I it was already the foundation was already there, and it
I
was
think you know
already
what.
doing well.
I'm gonna the second question I want to bring in, but the third one kind of goes to that and leads into the wrap up, kind of looking at. The second one is about the OGL problem that
Yeah,
cropped up
yeah,
towards the end of your tenure there. Um, I don't really want to ask these specific questions, but I think it's certainly a topic that's worth talking about a
sure,
little bit.
sure. Well, my view on this is and has been that the reason why people play Dungeons and Dragons, the appeal of it, again in business speak, we call the value proposition. What attracts people to the game is this opportunity to create and to be creative.
Right.
I think there are this is a conversation slash debate slash argument we would often have in the halls of Hasbro about D&D and what's special about it. And there are a lot of superficial similarities between Dungeons and Dragons and things like World of Warcraft or Skyrim, or there's a lot of superficial things that are the same. But I believe, and I argued that the people are attracted to those games for very different reasons. That there's certainly some overlap. There are a lot of people who play both, as I do. But why you play that tabletop game is you get to be creative. You get to put a part of yourself into that, whether it's creating your own world or even just creating your own character, or just
Right.
deciding in the moment what the thing is you want to do. And so for me, the OGL was important because the OGL was just doubled down on this idea of be creative, go make things, go make D&D your own, make your own stuff and share it with people. And I always felt that was a very, very important part of the overall program. Now, again, I can't go into too many details, but what sort of happened was D&D became so successful at Wizards and at Hasbro that it started to attract a lot of attention from other parts of the company, and other people started to, well, that's wow, that can,
Yeah.
we can do something with that. And and not to put too fine a point on it, but the executives at Hasbro just frankly had a very different idea for where the game should go and what it should be and how it should evolve than my own. We sort of
Right.
disagreed on that. Now, um, let me be very clear. I think those people are very smart people. They've proven that they're very smart people. I am not, I'm not. This isn't a personal thing. We just disagreed about where the game should go, and I decided that, well, they're going to take it in this direction, and Godspeed and good luck. But I think they need to, some of those people need their opportunity to do with it what they want to, and see where it goes. One of the points of contention was the OGL and the role that it played in the overall ecosystem. So I was not at all a fan of the talk about revisiting the OGL did start
Yeah.
long before it actually they attempted to operationalize it. It wasn't something that I thought that I believed in. I didn't think it was a good idea, and I argued against it. And what I can say is, I'm very pleased that they saw that reasonably quickly and altered course. I mean, again, I think it's unfortunate how it rolled out, but at the end, I'm very pleased that they sort of were able to recognize, oh, this is a big misstep, and let's undo it. So that's sort of my take on that.
I appreciate that. I think that's a clear and interesting take to draw those lines, and you know, you do. I think one of the things you said there that is not clear outside the the hallowed halls of any company is that uh, once a product succeeds to a certain level, it gets attractive to the people a level up who
Yeah,
come down and uh, there's a lot of business at the highest level, at the big C-suite level, that
yeah,
presumes that to some extent a product is a product, and what you do for one product you can do to another product. And there
yeah,
there's never I don't think that's ever really 100% true, but D&D is a product that really resists that, because what you're selling while you're selling the books, I wish I had one of while you're selling the books, so pull out the right, this is what you're selling. This is not what people and this is what people are handing over money for. This is not what they're buying. They're buying the game they play and the creative process you're talking about. And
yeah.
um,
Yeah, I mean, my position was, and I believe this firmly, that D&D, while it's a great business these days, is a very eccentric business. It's very unique, and it's not easy to point at anything else that's like it. By the way, Magic the Gathering is the same
right,
thing in my
right,
mind, and I used to make the point that, like, I I I don't understand the Magic the Gathering business at all. I mean, it's fantastic. It's much better than D&D. But I didn't, D&D is something I've been around for decades. I've played. I think I know. I'm confident I know the audience fairly well, and that sort of thing. It's an eccentric business, and that was the counsel that I would always give the C-suite, that it's a sort of a weird thing, and like, some of these ideas, as you say, that have worked well on other things, I'm not sure are going to translate that well. But again, I understand it, and it is the thing that's important for fans to understand is, this isn't done out of malice. It isn't done out of greed or anything like that. Like I said, it's just, this is the nature of large organizations, whether they're large companies or anything that's a larger. It's hard to get a
I think
large
those two
organization
statements are
alive.
can be in conflict with each other, but okay.
Oh yeah, they will be. They will be. It's absolutely inevitable. And so, I mean, I had been around long enough. I've been, Microsoft, which is a whole multiple orders of magnitude larger than Hasbro. Like, I was probably on the other end of this, on somebody's little Microsoft passion thing at one point. So yeah, I mean, I again, there's still a bit of a battle for the soul of D&D going on,
Yeah.
and I'm actually optimistic. I mean, again, I think some of this stuff is, it's taken a while, but I see signs that like again, they reversed course on the OGL, and I think the stuff they're doing now is terrific. And I still have very dear friends who work there and work on this stuff, and I'm really excited about
Yeah.
the stuff I'm seeing.
So yeah, Alpha Stream again. Thank you for these, and I want to point out to everyone again, Alpha Stream took advantage of the newsletter to
Yes,
send these questions in, so we could ask them.
and
You could do the
and
same.
and Alpha Stream, let me plug because I Teos is a very savvy, observer of the D&D scene, and I've seen some of the things that you've produced, and I think you've done a great job on that. And I know you have your stream or podcast or whatever, and I really plug that for D&D fans. Again, it's very savvy and really interesting insights into what's going on that are often quite accurate.
All right, so before we wrap up, I want to turn to it's the 50th anniversary. And we've got actually
Yes,
a question from Alpha Stream and one that Michael Pastor has put in the chat, and I kind of want to pull them together as a thought start, and then kind of have that conversation with you.
sure.
Alpha Stream's question is a question about how the job of leading the D&D team has changed over the years. What you think about that,
Yeah,
and the
yeah,
needs of working with upper management and designers and other departments, and
yeah,
how that changed from when we got in to where we are now and
yeah.
where we're going. And the other question Michael Pastor asked was, of all the game companies you've worked for, which do you think which do you think is RPG business at its best? Which of the ones have
Yeah,
kind of done the best kind of
yeah,
company? Now you can look at that as a business sense or best for the
yeah,
gamer. You
yeah.
can that's a tough
Well,
question on its own. But
sure.
let's
Well,
chat
let's
about
take
that
that
for a
one.
bit.
Let's take that one first because there are multiple dimensions you can look at that, right? And I think there are companies producing RPG material that I just think is exquisite and stellar, and I mean that almost from a creative or artistic sense. And and of course, it's no surprise that there's always a little bit of tension between, the art of it and the commerce of it. And this is one of the things that I know that there's again, D&D became so large and the audience became so large that unfortunately, a problem we would often have is some of the most engaged fans, the people who've been fans the longest, were frustrated with some of the stuff that we were doing. And that was because, we found ourselves like, yeah, we're now talking to this much, much larger, much broader audience that isn't necessarily looking for the same stuff. And I get that. And that was a hard problem in fact, that's a part of the answer to how running the D&D team has changed,
Right?
right? Is that you're no longer talking at a monolithic niche of an audience. You've got, the old time fans who want their deep Forgotten Realms lore, and you've got this huge group of the fastest growing age segment in D&D are 11 to 13-year-olds. You've got those people coming in who have none of this, background and that sort of thing. So you have to think about multiple audiences. But so on the artistic plane, I mean, I think, Chaosium has done some really great stuff, and all the things that have come out of that. I think Pendragon is one of the masterpieces
Yeah.
of RPG design. You know, uh, I love the stuff that they do. As a pure passion project, my friends at Green Ronin, Nicole, and they're just just passion. They've kept this thing going for so long, and I think is really really interesting. And I like the stuff that they're doing on a business plane. I think when it comes to RPG as a business and evolving it, there's this broader ecosystem that's starting to form around D&D. So a company like Roll20 is doing some really interesting stuff from a
Right.
business perspective and what they're doing. and I certainly follow that. So, but it's so hard for me to pick out individuals because I'm just a diehard
Yeah.
fan, and I love so many of these games from. And by the way, this is another important thing for fans to understand. So is everyone else on the D&D team. So I occasionally see these references to like, the D&D team, they just want to stamp out all these new games and like nothing could be further from the truth. Like we play all those games, we love those games. We did while I was there, we still do, and it's great. How has the job of running D&D evolved? I think there's a couple of ways. I already mentioned that you're now talking to you have to start, and this is what I was just starting to unpack and think about
Mm,
in my tenure, which is you can't look at the D&D audience as one audience anymore. Like what's the book the audience wants? Because it's not one audience. It's
right.
very large, and there are multiple audiences in there, and so a challenge that lies ahead for D&D is to figure out how to kind of segment the audience and produce different products for the different groups, and meet the needs of the different audience. That's one way it's changed. The second way it's changed is the importance of digital and being able to think digitally. And by that, I don't just mean distributing PDFs or distributing, the digital copies of the books through DDB. Um, when I left, we were already at a point where over 50% of D&D players were using D&D Beyond regularly, for character creation and
Right.
for whatever, those tools. And so I think we're entering an era in which, particularly D&D, but almost any RPG that aspires to reach a larger or broader audience is going to have some sort of digital strategy, not just content distribution, but things like remote play solution, whether it's through Roll20 or whatever, the sort of digital tools that D&D Beyond delivers to players that is starting to become expected in table stakes to be a big major RPG player. So I think
Mm,
someone running the D&D team has to understand technology at some level, and how to work in that space, I think. And then I touched on this before, but and again, I mean this with all due respect and in the most positive light, but D&D has become a large enough business now that it no longer it can no longer be that little thing over in the corner of Hasbro that
right.
some people like. It's now a major, important strategic pillar for Hasbro. And so what that means is, the D&D team, you need to be pretty skilled at diplomacy and things like that, and figuring out how to work within a large organization and how to plug into something like that. I mean, I think the three modes that D&D has been in for much of its existence, or it would sort of oscillate between justify that this thing should still exist to okay, it's fine, it's going, or at least in the Hasbro era, justify that this thing should exist, or okay, it's great, it's over there, it's making its dollars, it's fine, but it's just that little niche. We're past that now, and now it is, it's one of Hasbro's top 5 brands, and huge multi-million dollar initiatives revolve around things like that movie and all that stuff they're doing. And so you have to you just have to learn how
Yeah.
to be part of a bigger organization, and how to navigate those waters, I think, is very important.
I think weirdly, I was thinking while you were saying that, and I don't know what the right venue for this to happen, and maybe it just can't, is that to a greater extent the core of the audience, the folks you were talking about who've been fans for a long time, or even the
Yeah,
new folks who come in who pull into that amount of love for the game, that
yeah,
passion for the game, have to understand that the game, because of this, they their wish has been granted and the game has become wildly popular. But that means the game can't serve them as a business.
yeah,
They
or at
will
least
no
much
longer,
harder.
yeah, they'll
Yeah,
no longer
and
ever be the people that the products that the majority of products are made for.
yeah, and that's why, and by the way, that's another reason why I thought things like the OGL were so important,
Yeah.
because you can. a product that a segment of that audience, like I'm looking at, and I'm fairly impressed with the folks at EN World have done their whole like advanced version of 5e and all of that
Mm,
stuff, and I think there's some really cool, really interesting stuff in there. That's stuff that we couldn't have really published, but they can, and I hope it's doing really well for them.
right.
Or the DMs Guild, like a central point of disappointment I know from some of the ongoing fans was, what happened to the lore when Spelljammer comes out? Why isn't there, like all that lore we used to get, the big long, all the detail on all of that stuff? And it's like, well, because honestly, our broader audience, again, our focus is on make it your own, build your
Mm,
own stuff. And
right.
so, where we were having success was evolving more toward this, like the mantra we used to repeat over and over again to our designers is, it's not our world, it's their world. It's not our story, it's their story.
Right.
Your goal is to give them the tools and give them the seeds that they can use to build their own version of Spelljammer or whatever, which again, I still believe resonates with the largest segment of the D&D audience. But I understand it leaves, again, disappoints some of the older fans. Like, but I really want to learn what's happened in,
Right.
Ravenloft in the 25 years since we've seen it or
What
whatnot.
happened next? Yeah.
And that's where, I think something like the DMs Guild of like, okay, well, somebody can write that and publish that. And, we see, Keith Baker has really pushed forward a lot of the lore of Eberron
Right.
and that sort of thing, all in DM's Guild, and it's just so great that he can do that and he can address that audience. Now, again, I do think Wizards perhaps needs to do more of that in some way, but again, it's connected to that broader problem of, okay, now how do you stop thinking about the D&D audience and start thinking about these segments of the audience and how you reach them and what you do for them.
Yeah. I think. I mean, just flashing back to the things that you had said earlier. The In the past, when D&D was doing that, they were they were cannibalizing their audience. TSR was cannibalizing its audience because if you wanted the to know everything that's going on in the realms, you didn't need to know everything that was going on in Ravenloft, and maybe you didn't want to care at all about what was happening in Dark Sun, and so
Yeah.
so it's smaller and smaller groups, and as the business gets bigger and bigger, it can't afford to spend its time and
Yes.
money servicing those smaller groups.
And you certainly can't have a situation where, one of the things we talked about a lot in my era in D&D was this product dependency chain, where I think in hindsight, one of the big mistakes that TSR made was so many of the products they produced were dependent upon so many other products. So what I mean by that is, we roll out the Spelljammer box set. I'm talking about TSR now, and fans
Yeah.
love it. That's great. So now we're going to roll out the War Companion, whatever that companion set was. That's all about more advanced combat in Spelljammer. Well, the audience for that box is now not the whole universe of D&D players. It's the segment
The
of people who bought.
subsection of the people who bought the first one.
And now we start doing adventures for that War Companion box. So now we've just gone down another level,
Yeah.
and the audience just keeps getting smaller and smaller. And if you look at sort of the height of the TSR, era, the production schedule, it's like, oh my God, like half of these products are like 2 or 3 levels deep. And so that's also true on the lore level,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that, if the danger is you can run into these situations where, I buy some module or, some module series in Dark Sun a couple of years into its run, and I really have to understand everything that's transpired to
Right.
run
I mean,
that
yeah.
you know,
It happened.
in,
I know I've talked to Jeff Grubb and other folks who were
yeah,
there at the beginning of the realms. You put out a big box that this finds everything, and then you run a bunch of adventures that change it. And now, so you
right.
as the company, you want to keep selling that first box forever. But if the the further you change it, the more you either need to
Yep.
change that box or put in a second product, as you say, that is required reading before you can get to the new products that are coming.
And if I'm a new fan coming in,
Yeah,
and again, remember in my era, my tenure, lots of new fans were coming in, like a huge percentage. Something like half the audience had been playing D&D for 2 years or
yeah,
less. Something like that. How do I even start to absorb all of that?
yeah,
How do I back up in the 10 years of so that's what really started to push us more toward again, our vision was very much we were very inspired by the original Greyhawk folio. Like,
mm,
remember when the setting was this cool map and some stuff to get you going, but you were really gonna take it and turn it into whatever you wanted it to be. That was very much the where we sort of settled out with some of these
right,
things. And so again, in my one of my hard no's was we no product dependencies. Like outside that's why they're called the core books. Yes, you need the core books, but outside of that, you should never have to own a previous. So for instance, if you do see another Ravenloft product or Dragonlance product or something coming down the pike, if my philosophy holds, and again, who knows, they'll do whatever they're going to do. Like my hardcore thing was, okay, it has to stand on its own. We can't count on, oh well, they've already got the Spelljammer box, or it has to be its own sort of self-contained thing. So break off a new chunk of the Spelljammer whatever, and it's all about that, and you don't have to know anything beyond that, because again, we need to keep it friendly for new players. We really needed to avoid situations like, okay, so you're new to D&D, that's great. We're going to run this campaign, but before we start, let me spend hours explaining to you the Forgotten Realms and how it works and the history of that, and the spell plague and whatever all else is going to be important in there. So that's a real issue. And again, as I say, I'm one of those older fans myself. I'd love to, us designers would love to
right.
do deep stuff on that, but we had to keep sort of pulling ourselves back. So
Yeah. All right, Ray, we have hit an hour and a half, and I could keep doing this for another hour and a half, but
I could, once you get me talking about D&D, I will go
yeah.
forever. So
All right.
I
So as I
thank you,
often will
Stan.
end these saying, let's do it again. I would love to have you back to talk some more.
I would love it. It's been a delight. Thank you, Stan. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. It's a real pleasure. So,
All right.
and
Is
happy
there
50th,
anything you want to say a closing remark?
happy 50th Dungeons and Dragons. I am confident there will be 50 more years, and the game will change a lot more lives in those 50 years. And I very much look forward to seeing that and meeting some of those people.
May we both be around to see it.
Excellent.
All right. Hold on, Ray. I'm going to do an outro, and then you and I can say our
Okay.
stuff.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
All right. So thank you very much to Ray Wininger for taking the time to come here and hang out, have a chat. Uh, Man, I love these conversations. You know what? I've said before, I'm really enjoying this series. I'm enjoying 50 episodes of it because I get to have these conversations with folks. So I do hope I can get Ray back in the not too distant future. As Michael Pastor points out, yeah, we mentioned earlier in the show, the DC Heroes game is now go to Cryptozoic Games. Their website is where to look at it, reprinting the old 1980s DC Heroes games that Ray had a hand in. So yes, thank you, Ray, for joining me, and thank you, folks, for tuning in. As I've said a couple times here, we've got the 50 Years in the Dungeon.substack.com is our free newsletter. Please check that out. Please sign up. As I say, it's free. You'll get the info on what's coming up. You'll be the first people to see the finished art when it's done, and I will say thank you to you personally. What else do I have to say here? Wherever you're watching this, hopefully a lot of you are over on YouTube. Most of the watching is on YouTube, but wherever you're watching it, please take the second to click the like, the thumbs up button, whatever it is for your platform. That's very helpful. There's a reason why all the videos say that is because it literally is helpful. I'm not really making any money off this. Not that I'm against that. I wouldn't be against it, but this is not a monetized channel, and so that it would help me get towards that. It also mainly though helps to let YouTube know who else it should suggest us to, what other viewers, because they're tracking us, they're tracking us all, and they will find when you interact with the video, it tells them who else to suggest it to. And I've seen it popping up in more and more feeds, which means a lot of you have been doing this, and I thank you. But I'm asking you to do it again. Click the like, leave a comment, say hi, and come back next week when my guest will be, I don't know, someone else that'll be fun to talk to. That much I can guarantee.